In the autumn of 1957, Dr. Margaret Whitfield completed what would become her most controversial research project at the University of Edinburgh. Her doctoral thesis, titled The Psychological Origins of European Folk Narratives, a Study in Collective Trauma, would never see publication. The manuscript, containing over 400 pages of meticulous documentation, disappeared from the university archives during a routine transfer in 1962. What remained were scattered notes, witness testimonies, and a growing certainty among those who knew of her work that some stories were never meant to be preserved. Dr. Whitfield had embarked on an ambitious project to trace the historical origins of beloved fairy tales across multiple European regions. What began as academic curiosity evolved into something far more disturbing. Her research led her through remote villages in the Bavarian countryside, isolated hamlets in the Scottish Highlands, forgotten settlements in the Carpathian Mountains, and ancient communities nestled in the Norwegian fjords. In each location, she discovered that the sanitized versions of familiar tales bore little resemblance to their original forms. The first case that captured her attention emerged from the village of Rosenheim, nestled in the alpine foothills of Bavaria. Here, she encountered Heinrich Zimmermann, a 73-year-old clockmaker whose family had maintained oral traditions dating back 6 centuries. Heinrich possessed an extraordinary memory for detail, having learned the stories from his grandmother, who claimed to have witnessed the events that inspired what the world now knew as Hansel and Gretel. According to Heinrich's account, recorded in Dr. Whitfield's field notes, the tale originated during the brutal winter of 1647. 2 children, Klaus Huber, aged 19, and his sister Anna, aged 21, had indeed disappeared into the Bohemian forest during a period of severe famine. Their stepmother, Brigitte Huber, had convinced their father to abandon them, claiming the family lacked sufficient food stores to survive the winter. The children's remains were discovered 3 months later by a woodcutter named Johann Kastner. The scene he described to village authorities bore no resemblance to the whimsical gingerbread house of later retellings. Instead, Kastner reported finding the siblings in a crude shelter constructed against a fallen oak tree. Evidence suggested they had survived for weeks by consuming bark, roots, and eventually resorting to measures that the original documents could only hint at through euphemism. What disturbed Dr. Whitfield most was not the tale itself, but Heinrich's insistence that Brigitte Huber had known exactly where to direct them. Local records, preserved in the Rosenheim parish archives, indicated that Brigitte had previously worked as a midwife and herb gatherer in the same section of forest. The implication that the stepmother had deliberately sent the children to their deaths transformed the narrative from one of accidental abandonment to calculated murder. Dr. Whitfield's notes described Heinrich's demeanor during their interviews as unnaturally calm, almost detached. He spoke of generational trauma as if discussing the weather, explaining how the story had been passed down as a warning about the nature of human desperation. The version his grandmother told contained explicit details about the children's final weeks, descriptions that modern audiences would find unbearable. From Bavaria, Dr. Whitfield travelled north to the Scottish Highlands, specifically to the remote village of Kinlochwe, near Loch Maree. Here, she sought out Moira MacLeod, an 81-year-old woman known locally as the keeper of old stories. Moira's family had maintained an unbroken oral tradition spanning nearly 400 years, including the original version of what eventually became known as Sleeping Beauty. The story Moira related bore little resemblance to the romantic tale familiar to modern audiences. Set in the 16th century, it concerned a young woman named Alias Fraser, whose family controlled a strategic position along one of the Highland passes. At the age of 22, Aelius had fallen into what local physicians described as a peculiar sleeping sickness that lasted for months. Dr. Whitfield's documentation revealed that Aelius's condition coincided with political upheaval between rival clan factions. The Fraser family found themselves caught between competing loyalties during a period of violent territorial disputes. According to Moira's account, Aelius's mysterious illness provided convenient cover for negotiations that might otherwise have been seen as treasonous. The truth, as preserved in the MacLeod family tradition, was far more sinister. Aelius had discovered correspondence indicating that her father planned to arrange her marriage to a much older chieftain from a rival clan, effectively selling her to secure a political alliance. When she threatened to expose the arrangement publicly, her family began administering small doses of a plant-based compound that induced prolonged unconsciousness. Dr. Whitfield's medical consultation with a toxicologist at the University of Glasgow confirmed that several Highland plants, when properly prepared, could produce symptoms matching those described in the oral tradition. The combination of monkshood and deadly nightshade, both native to the Scottish Highlands, could indeed create a death-like sleep lasting for months. Moira MacLeod's recitation included details that never appeared in later sanitized versions. The original tale described Aelius's gradual physical deterioration during her enforced unconsciousness, the family's elaborate deception to maintain the pretense of caring for their sleeping daughter, and the eventual arrival of a young man who had been secretly corresponding with Aelius before her illness began. The MacLeod family version concluded not with a magical awakening, but with Aelius's rescue by her lover and their subsequent flight from the Highlands. The couple's disappearance marked the end of the Fraser family's political influence in the region, as their carefully orchestrated alliance collapsed without the promised marriage. Dr. Whitfield noted that Moira MacLeod appeared to derive no pleasure from recounting these stories. The elderly woman spoke with the mechanical precision of someone fulfilling an obligation, frequently pausing to stare out the window at the surrounding hills. She mentioned that previous generations had warned against sharing these accounts with outsiders, believing that speaking of such events could somehow summon similar misfortunes. The researcher's journey next took her to the Carpathian Mountains of Romania, where she investigated the origins of tales that would eventually influence the story of Little Red Riding Hood. In the village of Săcel, nestled in the Maramureș region, she encountered Gheorghe Popescu, a 70-year-old shepherd whose family had lived in the area for over 5 centuries. Gheorghe's version of the tale centered on events from the winter of 1683, during a period of Ottoman raids that terrorized rural communities throughout the region. The story involved a young woman named Elena Dragomir, aged 24, who regularly traveled between isolated settlements to deliver medicines prepared by her grandmother. According to Popescu family tradition, Elena's grandmother, Caterina, served as the region's primary healer, maintaining extensive knowledge of herbal remedies and midwifery. Elena's journeys often took her through dense forest paths, connecting communities that might otherwise go months without contact during the harsh mountain winters. The incident that inspired the tale occurred during one of Elena's routine visits to the village of Breb, approximately 15 kilometers through treacherous mountain terrain. She had departed Săcel, carrying supplies for treating an outbreak of fever that had affected several families in the remote community. Dr. Whitfield's notes described Gheorghe's account with clinical detachment. According to the oral tradition, Elena never reached Breb. Her disappearance triggered a search involving men from 3 separate villages, but the winter weather and threat of Ottoman patrols limited their ability to conduct thorough investigations. Elena's remains were discovered the following spring by hunters tracking wild boar through the forest. The scene they encountered suggested she had been pursued and cornered in a small clearing approximately halfway between the two villages. Evidence indicated she had attempted to defend herself, but physical examination revealed injuries consistent with an attack by multiple assailants. What transformed this tragedy into the foundation for a cautionary tale was the subsequent investigation into Elena's final day. Witnesses in Sicel reported seeing a stranger in the village on the morning of her departure, a man claiming to be a merchant seeking directions to Breb. This individual had engaged Elena in conversation, learning details about her planned route and the timing of her journey. The Popescu family tradition maintained that Elena's attacker had not been a wild animal, as later sanitized versions suggested, but rather a human predator who had specifically targeted her based on advanced knowledge of her movements. The wolf of the eventual fairy tale served as metaphor for the calculated nature of the crime. Gheorghe's recounting included details about Elena's grandmother's response to the tragedy. Katerina had reportedly blamed herself for allowing Elena to travel alone, despite knowing that recent political instability had made the forest paths increasingly dangerous. The old woman's grief and guilt became integral elements of the story's moral framework. Dr. Whitfield observed that Gheorghe Popescu spoke of these events as if they had occurred within living memory, despite the nearly 3-century gap. He described the psychological impact on the community, explaining how Elena's murder had effectively ended the practice of young women traveling alone between villages, fundamentally altering social patterns that had existed for generations. The researchers' final major investigation brought her to the coastal regions of Norway, specifically to the fishing village of Å in the Lofoten Islands. Here, she sought out Astrid Eriksson, a 78-year-old woman whose family maintained oral traditions dating to the medieval period, including the original version of what became known as the Little Mermaid. The story Astrid related bore no resemblance to the romantic narrative that would later captivate audiences worldwide. Set in the 13th century, it concerned a young woman named Ingrid Haugen, whose family controlled one of the few natural harbors suitable for large vessels along that stretch of coastline. Dr. Whitfield's documentation revealed that Ingrid's story unfolded during a period of intense competition between Norwegian fishing families and foreign traders seeking access to profitable cod fishing grounds. The Haugen family's harbor provided strategic advantage, making them wealthy but also vulnerable to pressure from rival interests. According to Eriksson family tradition, Ingrid had been promised in marriage to Magnus Nordahl, the son of another prominent fishing family, in an arrangement designed to consolidate control over the region's maritime trade. However, Ingrid had secretly fallen in love with a foreign merchant named Erik Vestergaard, whose ship regularly anchored in the Haugen harbor. The tragedy that inspired the mermaid tale occurred during the summer of 1297, when Ingrid attempted to flee with Vestergaard aboard his vessel. The original plan called for the couple to depart during the night, when Ingrid's absence would not be immediately noticed. Astrid's recounting described how Ingrid's father, Olaf Haugen, discovered the escape attempt and pursued the lovers' boat with several armed men. The confrontation occurred in open water, approximately 3 kilometers from shore, during conditions of poor visibility due to heavy fog. Dr. Whitfield's notes documented the tragic conclusion with characteristic academic precision. The Eriksson family tradition maintained that Olaf Haugen's pursuit resulted in a violent confrontation that left both Ingrid and Vestergaard dead. Rather than face the political consequences of murdering a foreign merchant, Haugen ordered his men to dispose of both bodies at sea. The transformation of this tale into a story about mermaids and sea witches occurred gradually over subsequent generations. The original account described how Ingrid's body was never recovered, leading to speculation among villagers about her fate. Some claimed to have seen her spirit walking along the shoreline, calling for her lost lover. Astrid Eriksson's delivery of this narrative struck Dr. Whitfield as particularly disturbing. The elderly woman spoke with the rhythmic cadence of someone reciting a well-memorized text, but her eyes remained fixed on the harbour throughout the recitation. She explained that the Eriksson family had served as witnesses to these events, having provided testimony to regional authorities investigating Vestergaard's disappearance. The researcher noted that Astrid appeared to take no comfort in the romanticized versions of the tale that had emerged in later centuries. She expressed frustration with what she termed the corruption of Ingrid's story, arguing that transforming a tale of murder and family betrayal into a romantic fantasy dishonored the memory of the actual victims. Dr. Whitfield's investigation revealed a pattern extending far beyond these individual cases. In village after village, she discovered that beloved fairy tales had originated as accounts of actual tragedies, usually involving young women who had challenged social conventions or threatened established power structures. The researchers' analysis suggested that the gradual sanitization of these stories served multiple purposes beyond simple entertainment. By transforming accounts of real violence into magical narratives, communities could preserve warnings about dangerous behaviors while avoiding the psychological burden of confronting actual historical trauma. Her documentation included extensive correspondence with folklorists across Europe, many of whom expressed reluctance to discuss the implications of her findings. Several colleagues warned her against pursuing publication, arguing that revealing the violent origins of popular stories could cause significant psychological harm to both children and adults who had found comfort in the familiar tales. Dr. Whitfield's final notes, discovered among her personal effects after her death in 1968, revealed her growing concern about the psychological impact of her research. She wrote extensively about recurring nightmares featuring the individuals whose stories she had documented, describing vivid dreams in which the historical victims pleaded with her to restore their true narratives. The researcher's correspondence from her final years indicated increasing isolation from both academic colleagues and family members. She wrote of feeling burdened by knowledge that she could neither publish nor forget, describing herself as a keeper of secrets that were too heavy for one person to carry. In her final letter, addressed to her sister but never sent, Dr. Whitfield expressed regret about pursuing the research project. She wrote that discovering the truth behind beloved stories had fundamentally altered her relationship with literature, history, and human nature itself. The knowledge that generation after generation had found comfort in sanitized versions of actual tragedies struck her as a profound commentary on humanity's capacity for self-deception. The letter concluded with Dr. Whitfield's observation that fairy tales served as a form of collective amnesia, allowing societies to preserve the essential warnings embedded in tragic events, while avoiding the psychological burden of confronting the actual violence that had inspired those warnings. She wondered whether this transformation represented a necessary adaptation or a dangerous form of denial. Following Dr. Whitfield's death, several of her former colleagues attempted to reconstruct her research using the scattered notes and recordings that remained. However, their efforts were hampered by the resistance they encountered from the families and communities she had studied. Many of her original sources refused to speak with subsequent researchers, claiming that sharing the stories had brought misfortune to their families. Heinrich Zimmermann, the Bavarian clockmaker, who had provided detailed accounts of the Hansel and Gretel origins, died in a house fire 3 months after Dr. Whitfield's final interview. Local authorities attributed the incident to an accident involving his workshop furnace, but neighbours reported hearing him speaking to unseen individuals in the hours before the fire began. Moira MacLeod, the Scottish keeper of the Sleeping Beauty tradition, suffered a stroke within weeks of Dr. Whitfield's departure from the Highlands. She recovered partially, but lost the ability to speak, spending her final years sitting silently by her window, staring at the same hills where Elias Fraser had once planned her escape. Gheorghe Popescu, the Romanian shepherd who had shared the Little Red Riding Hood origins, disappeared during the winter following Dr. Whitfield's visit. Search teams found no trace of him despite extensive efforts. His family reported that he had become increasingly agitated in the months after recounting Elena Dragomir's story, often speaking of seeing wolves in areas where none had been spotted for decades. Astrid Eriksson, the Norwegian keeper of the mermaid tale, survived longest among Dr. Whitfield's sources, but suffered recurring episodes of what local physicians described as selective amnesia. She would forget the stories she had spent decades preserving, then suddenly recall them with disturbing clarity during periods of extreme distress. The pattern of misfortune affecting Dr. Whitfield's sources did not go unnoticed among academic circles. Several anthropologists who had initially shown interest in continuing her research quietly abandoned their projects. The University of Edinburgh sealed her remaining notes and recordings, officially citing privacy concerns, but privately acknowledging the unsettling coincidences surrounding everyone associated with the work. In 1965, a final attempt to locate Dr. Whitfield's complete research files led investigators to a storage facility in Glasgow where she had rented space under an assumed name. The facility contained hundreds of additional recordings, photographs, and documents that had never been catalogued by the university. Among these materials, researchers discovered audio recordings of interviews with sources Dr. Whitfield had never mentioned in her official documentation. These recordings captured conversations with individuals who claimed to possess knowledge of fairy tale origins from across Europe, including accounts from locations Dr. Whitfield had never visited according to her travel records. The additional recordings revealed that Dr. Whitfield's investigation had expanded far beyond her original academic framework. In later interviews, she could be heard asking sources about their personal experiences with the stories, whether they had noticed any unusual occurrences after sharing the accounts, and if they believed the historical victims might somehow be aware of how their stories had been transformed. One recording, dated just weeks before her death, captured Dr. Whitfield speaking with an unidentified elderly woman whose voice carried what linguistics experts described as an archaic dialect not heard in modern times. The conversation focused on what the woman termed the price of remembering, suggesting that preserving accurate accounts of historical tragedies created some form of obligation to the original victims. The unidentified woman warned Dr. Whitfield that her research had awakened something that should have remained undisturbed, describing the gradual transformation of violent historical events into comforting fairy tales as a necessary form of protection. She suggested that restoring the original narratives could somehow bridge the gap between past and present, creating connections that the human mind was not equipped to handle. Dr. Whitfield's responses to these warnings, preserved on the recordings, revealed her growing obsession with what she termed narrative justice. She spoke of feeling obligated to restore dignity to the historical victims whose true stories had been buried beneath layers of fantasy and sanitization. In her final recorded statement, made just days before her death, Dr. Whitfield described experiencing what she called temporal bleeding, claiming to hear voices from the past commenting on her research. She spoke of feeling watched by individuals who could not possibly be present. and of recurring dreams in which the historical victims of the stories expressed gratitude for her efforts to preserve their truth. The recording concluded with Dr. Whitfield's observation that fairy tales might serve as more than simple entertainment or moral instruction. She theorized that the stories functioned as a form of cultural scar tissue, covering psychological wounds too deep for direct examination, while preserving just enough truth to serve as warning to future generations. Her final words, barely audible on the recording, suggested that she had come to understand why previous generations had chosen to transform these violent historical accounts into magical narratives. The burden of carrying accurate knowledge about humanity's capacity for cruelty, particularly cruelty directed toward young women who challenged social expectations, had proven too heavy for sustained psychological health. The Glasgow storage facility was sealed by university authorities in 1966, with Dr. Whitfield's additional materials classified as potentially harmful to public welfare. Official statements cited concerns about the psychological impact of the recordings on both researchers and potential audiences, particularly given the pattern of misfortune affecting everyone who had participated in the original study. However, incomplete transcripts of Dr. Whitfield's final recordings began circulating among European folklorists and anthropologists during the late 1960s. These transcripts revealed the existence of a vast network of individuals across multiple countries who possessed detailed knowledge of fairy tale origins, many of whom had never been formally interviewed by academic researchers. The transcripts suggested that Dr. Whitfield had discovered evidence of coordinated efforts to preserve accurate historical accounts of the events that inspired popular fairy tales, maintained by families and communities across Europe for centuries. These unofficial historians had apparently operated independently of academic institutions, passing down detailed oral traditions through carefully selected individuals within each generation. According to the transcripts, many of these traditional knowledge keepers had expressed reluctance to share their information with Dr. Whitfield, warning her that accurate historical accounts carried psychological and spiritual obligations that academic researchers were unprepared to handle. They described themselves as guardians of dangerous knowledge, protecting both the historical victims and modern audiences from truths too disturbing for casual examination. The network of traditional historians apparently included individuals who possessed knowledge of fairy tale origins from regions Dr. Whitfield had never visited, suggesting that her research had touched upon a phenomenon extending across much of Europe. The transcripts hinted at stories behind familiar tales, including Cinderella, Snow White, Beauty and the Beast, and dozens of lesser-known narratives. One transcript fragment, attributed to an elderly man from the Black Forest region of Germany, described the original Cinderella account as involving a young woman who had been systematically poisoned by her stepfamily over a period of months. The familiar elements of the story, the deceased mother, the cruel stepfamily, the transformation at midnight, apparently served as metaphorical representations of actual events involving inheritance fraud and attempted murder. Another fragment, from a source in rural France, outlined the historical basis for Beauty and the Beast as an account of a young woman sold into marriage with a man suffering from a disfiguring disease. The transformation that concluded the story apparently referred to the woman's psychological adaptation to her circumstances rather than any magical change in her husband's appearance. These additional accounts followed the same pattern Dr. Whitfield had documented in her primary research. Beloved stories that served to preserve warnings about dangerous human behaviors while protecting audiences from the full psychological impact of the historical tragedies that had inspired them. The transcript fragments also revealed that Dr. Whitfield's sources had provided information about the psychological and spiritual traditions surrounding these preserved accounts, Many traditional knowledge keepers apparently believed that the historical victims retained some form of awareness or presence, particularly when their stories were recounted in forms that honored their actual experiences, rather than the sanitized versions familiar to modern audiences. Several sources described experiencing unusual phenomena after sharing accurate historical accounts with Dr. Whitfield, including vivid dreams featuring the historical victims, unexplained sounds in their homes, and sensations of being observed by unseen individuals. These experiences apparently intensified when the sources attempted to discuss their knowledge with other people, leading many to conclude that the information was meant to remain carefully guarded. The final transcript fragment, dated just days before Dr. Whitfield's death, captured a conversation with an unidentified source who claimed to have witnessed the researcher's psychological deterioration firsthand. This individual described Dr. Whitfield as appearing to be in dialogue with invisible participants, frequently pausing during conversations as if listening to unheard voices. According to this final source, Dr. Whitfield had become convinced that her research had created some form of connection between the present day and the historical periods when the original tragedies had occurred. She spoke of feeling obligated to serve as a voice for victims who had been silenced by time and by the gradual transformation of their stories into entertainment. The source's account concluded with Dr. Whitfield's apparent belief that fairy tales represented humanity's attempt to process collective trauma while avoiding the full psychological burden of confronting actual historical violence. She theorized that the magical elements added to historical accounts served as psychological protection, allowing essential warnings to be preserved and transmitted without overwhelming audiences with the reality of human cruelty. In the decades following Dr. Whitfield's death and the sealing of her research materials, several attempts were made to locate and interview the traditional knowledge keepers she had identified. However, most of these individuals had either died or moved from their original communities, and their families proved unwilling to discuss the information that had been shared with the researcher. The few sources who could be located refused to provide detailed information to subsequent researchers, claiming that Dr. Whitfield's fate served as a warning about the dangers of pursuing such knowledge outside the traditional framework of carefully controlled oral transmission. Many expressed belief that academic research methods were fundamentally incompatible with the spiritual obligations attached to preserving accurate historical accounts. Several folklorists who attempted to continue Dr. Whitfield's work reported experiencing unusual difficulties during their research, including equipment failures, unexpected illness, and resistance from local communities that had previously been cooperative with academic investigations. These challenges contributed to a gradual abandonment of efforts to verify or expand upon her findings. By 1969, Dr. Whitfield's research had become something of a cautionary tale within academic circles, used as an example of the psychological dangers that could result from excessive immersion in disturbing historical material. Her work was rarely cited in subsequent folklore studies, and efforts to access her sealed materials were consistently denied by university authorities. The transformation of Dr. Whitfield herself into a kind of folklore figure represented an ironic conclusion to her investigation into the relationship between historical reality and narrative sanitization. Like the fairy tale victims whose true stories she had sought to preserve, her own account gradually acquired mythical qualities that obscured the actual facts of her research and death. Some versions of Dr. Whitfield's story, circulating among graduate students and junior faculty, portrayed her as a woman driven to madness by exposure to historical trauma. Others suggested she had discovered dangerous secrets that powerful interests had wanted to keep hidden. A few claimed she had somehow become trapped between the past and present, serving as an unwilling medium for historical victims seeking recognition. These various interpretations of Dr. Whitfield's fate followed the same pattern she had documented in her research. A complex and disturbing historical reality gradually transformed into narratives that preserved essential warnings while protecting audiences from the full psychological impact of actual events. The sealed storage facility in Glasgow remained undisturbed until 1968, when a fire of unknown origin destroyed the building and all its contents. Official investigations attributed the blaze to electrical problems, but witnesses reported seeing figures moving through the building hours before the fire began, despite the facility having been vacant for months. The destruction of Dr. Whitfield's remaining materials marked the apparent end of any possibility for subsequent researchers to verify or expand upon her findings. However, rumors persisted within folklore and anthropology communities about individuals who possessed copies of her recordings or transcripts, suggesting that fragments of her work might have survived the official efforts to contain it. In her personal journal, discovered among her effects but never made public, Dr. Whitfield wrote extensively about her growing conviction that fairy tales served purposes beyond entertainment or moral instruction. She theorized that these stories functioned as a form of cultural immune system, preserving essential survival information while protecting the collective psyche from trauma too severe for direct processing. Her final entry, written just hours before her death, expressed both regret and fascination about her discoveries. She wrote of feeling honored to have served as a temporary guardian for stories that revealed fundamental truths about human nature, but also acknowledged that some knowledge carried obligations too heavy for individual consciousness to bear. Dr. Whitfield concluded her final entry with the observation that every generation must choose between confronting historical reality and accepting comfortable myths. She suggested that the transformation of violent historical events into magical narratives represented a collective decision to prioritize psychological survival over factual accuracy, a choice that might be both necessary and tragic. The journal's final page contained only a single line, written in handwriting, that graphologists later described as significantly different from Dr. Whitfield's usual script: "Some doors, once opened, can never be closed again." Today, more than 60 years after Dr. Whitfield completed her research, the questions she raised about the relationship between historical reality and cultural narrative remain largely unexplored. The academic community's reluctance to pursue her line of investigation has left her findings isolated, neither verified nor definitively refuted. The traditional knowledge keepers she identified across Europe appear to have withdrawn further from contact with outside researchers, taking their carefully preserved historical accounts deeper into the protective obscurity of family and community traditions. The network of individuals who maintained accurate fairy tale origins has apparently adapted to protect their information from academic scrutiny. Meanwhile, the sanitized versions of these stories continue to provide comfort and moral instruction to new generations of children and adults, serving their protective function without revealing the violent historical realities that inspired them. The transformation that Dr. Whitfield documented, from historical tragedy to magical narrative, continues to shield audiences from psychological burden while preserving essential warnings about human nature. The few scholars who remember Dr. Whitfield's work describe it as a cautionary tale about the dangers of pursuing knowledge without considering its psychological and spiritual implications. Her fate serves as a reminder that some forms of historical investigation may require preparation and support systems that academic institutions are not equipped to provide. Yet questions remain about what was lost when Dr. Whitfield's research was sealed and ultimately destroyed. The possibility that beloved fairy tales preserve accurate historical accounts of violence against young women who challenged social expectations represents a significant gap in both folklore studies and historical understanding. Perhaps most disturbing is the implication that the pattern Dr. Whitfield documented, the systematic transformation of female victims into mythical figures, continues in modern times, suggesting that the psychological mechanisms she identified remain active in contemporary culture. The stories she uncovered speak to fundamental questions about how societies process trauma, preserve warnings, and balance psychological protection with historical accuracy. These questions extend far beyond academic folklore studies, touching on the nature of memory, identity, and collective responsibility. Dr. Whitfield's work suggests that fairy tales may represent one of humanity's most sophisticated methods for managing the psychological burden of historical violence while preserving essential survival information for future generations. If accurate, this insight transforms familiar stories from simple entertainment into complex cultural artifacts worthy of far more serious consideration. The fact that this consideration has been largely avoided since Dr. Whitfield's death raises additional questions about what contemporary society chooses to examine and what it prefers to leave undisturbed. The protective sanitization she documented may extend to the academic and cultural response to her own research. In the end, Dr. Whitfield's investigation into the grim reality behind beloved fairy tales became itself a kind of cautionary tale, warning about the psychological dangers of seeking historical truth without adequate preparation for its implications. Like the stories she studied, her own account has been gradually sanitized through retelling, protecting subsequent generations from the full impact of her discoveries. The voices she claimed to hear, the obligations she described feeling toward historical victims, and the network of traditional knowledge keepers she identified remain unexplored mysteries that may hold keys to understanding not just the origins of familiar stories, but the fundamental relationship between past and present, memory and myth, protection and truth. Perhaps some doors should remain closed, or perhaps the real tragedy lies in allowing fear to prevent us from honoring those whose stories have been buried beneath layers of well-intentioned fiction. Dr. Margaret Whitfield devoted her final years to wrestling with this question, and her struggle continues to echo in the silence that has surrounded her work ever since. The fairy tales continue to enchant new generations, their dark origins safely buried beneath magical transformations and happy endings. But somewhere in the space between memory and myth, the voices that Dr. Whitfield heard may still be waiting for someone willing to listen, to remember, and to carry the weight of stories too heavy for comfortable telling. In 1969, the last known attempt to access Dr. Whitfield's research occurred when her niece, Catherine Whitfield Morris, petitioned the University of Edinburgh for permission to review her aunt's personal effects. The request was denied without explanation, and Catherine reported receiving anonymous warnings to abandon her inquiries within days of filing the petition. Catherine's correspondence, preserved in family archives, revealed her growing conviction that her aunt's death had been neither natural nor accidental. She described finding cryptic notes hidden throughout Dr. Whitfield's personal library, notes that referenced watchers and guardians who monitored those who possessed dangerous knowledge about the true nature of folkloric traditions. The final documented reference to Dr. Whitfield's work appeared in a 1970 academic conference paper titled The Psychological Hazards of Folklore Research, presented by Dr. James Morrison of Cambridge University. Morrison briefly mentioned unnamed research that had resulted in severe psychological disturbance among both primary investigators and their sources, recommending that future folklore studies include mandatory psychological support protocols. Morrison's paper was withdrawn from publication after the conference, reportedly due to pressure from senior faculty members who argued that discussing such incidents could discourage legitimate academic research. No copies of the paper are known to exist in public archives. Today, the villages where Dr. Whitfield conducted her research maintain their silence. In Rosenheim, Bavaria, the clockmaker's shop that once belonged to Heinrich Zimmermann remains empty, with local residents claiming the building cannot retain tenants for longer than a few months. In the Scottish Highlands near Kinlochove, tourists occasionally report hearing a woman's voice calling across Loch Mari during the early morning hours, though no source for the sound is ever identified. The Romanian village of Săsel continues to report unusually high numbers of visitors who claim to be researching local folklore, though these individuals typically depart after only brief stays, often appearing disturbed by their experiences. In the Norwegian fishing village of O, fishermen speak in whispers of strange lights seen moving across the harbour on nights when the fog rolls in from the sea. These scattered reports suggest that the questions Dr. Whitfield raised about the relationship between historical trauma and cultural narrative continue to resonate, drawing new seekers to the locations where she conducted her final research. However, the pattern of abbreviated investigations and reluctant withdrawal indicates that whatever she discovered remains as psychologically challenging today as it was 6 decades ago. The fairy tales themselves persist in their sanitized forms, continuing to provide comfort and moral guidance while their violent origins remain hidden beneath layers of magical thinking and happy endings. Children still delight in stories of brave heroes and transformed villains, unaware that they may be consuming carefully processed accounts of actual human suffering. Perhaps this protection serves its intended purpose, shielding developing minds from historical truths too harsh for young consciousness to process. Or perhaps, as Dr. Whitfield came to believe, this sanitization represents a form of cultural amnesia that dishonors the memory of those whose true stories have been buried beneath fantasy. The academic community's continued reluctance to pursue her line of research suggests that some questions may be too dangerous for institutional investigation, requiring forms of preparation and support that traditional scholarship cannot provide. The price of seeking certain types of historical truth may exceed what individual researchers can safely bear. Yet the silence surrounding Dr. Whitfield's work raises troubling questions about what other aspects of cultural heritage remain unexplored due to fear of psychological consequences. If beloved stories indeed preserve accounts of systematic violence against women who challenged social expectations, then avoiding this knowledge may perpetuate the very patterns of harm that the original victims experienced. The traditional knowledge keepers Dr. Whitfield identified understood these dangers, maintaining their information within carefully controlled systems of oral transmission that included spiritual and psychological preparation for those who would carry such burdens. Academic research, with its emphasis on publication and broad dissemination, may be fundamentally incompatible with the responsible preservation of dangerous historical truth. In her final writings, Dr. Whitfield suggested that fairy tales represent humanity's most sophisticated attempt to balance historical preservation with psychological protection. This balance, maintained over centuries through gradual narrative transformation, may be too delicate for academic intervention. The stories continue their protective function, warning new generations about dangerous behaviors while shielding them from the full psychological impact of historical reality. Meanwhile, the voices of the original victims remain safely contained within magical frameworks that honor their experiences while making them psychologically bearable. Dr. Margaret Whitfield's investigation revealed that some forms of knowledge carry obligations that extend beyond academic curiosity. Her fate serves as a reminder that the relationship between past and present, memory and myth, protection and truth, remains as complex and dangerous today as it was when the first storytellers chose to transform accounts of actual tragedy into tales of magical transformation. The fairy tales endure, their dark secrets intact, continuing to serve generations of children who sleep peacefully, unaware that their beloved bedtime stories may preserve the voices of those who found no such peace in their final moments. And perhaps, in the space between memory and forgetting, between history and myth, that protection is exactly as it should be.